At our family dinner, my daughter-in-law leaned in close, her expensive perfume masking the scent of her deceit, and whispered, "I'm pregnant with your husband's baby." The words slithered into my ear like a viper, chilling the blood in my veins, yet I didn't drop my heavy silver fork or gasp in horror as she clearly expected me to do. "My name is Martha Sterling, I am 61 years old, and my meticulously maintained silver bob and perfectly tailored navy blue twinsets have always served as a suit of armor in my affluent, socially demanding world." Across the antique mahogany dining table sat my husband, Robert, a 64-year-old retired architecture professor whose thinning gray hair, rectangular tortoiseshell glasses, and signature tweed jackets usually gave him an air of comforting academic authority, but tonight, his eyes were fixed entirely on his plate of untouched roast lamb. Next to him was our 30-year-old son, Harrison, a brilliant but perpetually exhausted software developer with messy brown hair and earnest green eyes, wearing his usual faded flannel and jeans, completely oblivious to the psychological warfare happening 3 feet away from him. And then there was Isabella, my 26-year-old daughter-in-law, a woman whose sleek platinum blonde hair, icy blue eyes, and expensive, minimalist white silk dresses always made her look like an apex predator hiding in plain sight. As Isabella pulled back from my ear, a triumphant, malicious smirk playing on her glossed lips, she waited for the explosion, for the tears, for the destruction of my 35-year marriage right there over the cranberry sauce. Instead, I let out a soft, melodious laugh, reaching over to pat her perfectly manicured hand while locking my piercing hazel eyes directly onto hers, noticing how her smirk instantly faltered into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. "How incredibly imaginative of you, dear," I said calmly, my voice projecting just enough for Robert to flinch violently in his chair, his sudden movement knocking over his crystal water goblet and sending a dark stain spreading across my heirloom linen tablecloth. The sheer panic in Robert's eyes as he frantically dabbed at the spill wasn't the look of a guilty lover, it was the look of a terrified hostage, and in that split second, I knew with absolute certainty that Isabella was lying about the affair, but the true horror was that my husband was somehow being forced to play along. I survived the rest of that excruciating dinner by retreating behind a wall of polite, aristocratic small talk, forcing Isabella to engage in mundane conversations about weather patterns and landscaping while my mind raced through every interaction, every bank statement, and every hushed phone call I had witnessed in our home over the past 6 months. When Harrison and Isabella finally left, Harrison giving me a tight, stressed hug while Isabella shot me a glare of pure venom, Robert practically sprinted up the grand oak staircase to our master suite without saying a single word to me. I waited in the silent, darkened foyer for a full 20 minutes, listening to the rhythmic ticking of our grandfather clock, before I silently slipped into Robert's ground floor study, a room I usually avoided out of respect for his privacy. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and old paper, and I immediately began opening drawers, sliding my hands under heavy stacks of academic journals and architectural blueprints, searching for the invisible chain Isabella was using to choke my husband. My fingers brushed against something hard and metallic taped securely to the underside of the center desk drawer, and with a sharp pull, I dislodged a cheap, prepaid burner phone that looked entirely out of place in Robert's world of luxury and refined tastes. Just as I pressed the power button and watched the harsh white screen illuminate the dark room, a notification chimed softly, revealing a text message that made my heart hammer violently against my ribs. The message read, "She didn't believe it. We need to accelerate the timeline and double the demand." I stared at the glowing screen, my hands trembling slightly as I realized this wasn't just a cruel family dispute, it was a highly coordinated extortion plot, and just as I moved to unlock the device to trace the number, the heavy wooden door of the study began to slowly creep open behind me. "Martha?" Robert's voice called out from the darkness of the hallway, thick with a terror I had never heard before, forcing me to shove the phone deep into the pocket of my slacks and turn around with a practiced, innocent smile. Seeing those sinister words glow on a hidden burner phone in my husband's dark study, I realized my perfect 35-year marriage was actually a carefully constructed crime scene waiting to be uncovered. I offered Robert a casual excuse about looking for a stamp, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline surging through my system, and retreated to our bedroom, spending the entire night staring at the ceiling moldings while Robert tossed and turned beside me in a cold sweat. The next morning, under the guise of attending my weekly garden club meeting, I drove my silver sedan 3 blocks away, parked strategically behind a row of tall hedges, and waited for Robert's vintage Volvo to pull out of our long driveway. When he finally left, driving much faster and more erratically than his usual cautious pace, I tailed him from a safe distance, keeping 2 cars between us as he merged onto the highway and headed toward the dilapidated industrial district on the edge of town, a stark contrast to our manicured suburban life. He pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of an abandoned textile mill, and I quickly parked behind a rusted dumpster, grabbing a small pair of opera glasses from my glove compartment to watch the scene unfold. Robert stepped out of his car, clutching a thick manila envelope to his chest like a shield, the autumn wind whipping his tweed jacket around his thin frame, making him look incredibly frail and vulnerable. A few moments later, a heavy-duty black pickup truck roared into the lot, and out stepped Julian Vance, our 28-year-old estate manager, a man whose muscular build, curly black hair, and rugged denim work shirts usually projected reliable blue-collar charm, but today, his demeanor was aggressive and menacing. Julian marched right up to my husband, snatching the envelope from Robert's trembling hands and ripping it open to reveal thick stacks of $100 bills, counting them rapidly with practiced, greedy precision. I adjusted the focus on my opera glasses, my heart dropping into my stomach as I realized the trusted contractor who had spent the last 8 months renovating our historical home was somehow the enforcer in Isabella's twisted extortion scheme. But just as Julian sneered and shoved the money into his heavy canvas jacket, a sudden glint of sunlight catching on metal drew my attention to the far corner of the abandoned lot. Another vehicle was idling silently in the shadows of a collapsed loading dock, a sleek, dark gray SUV with heavily tinted windows, and as the driver's side window slowly rolled down just a few inches, I caught a glimpse of a face that made the breath completely leave my lungs. It was Harrison, my sweet, exhausted, brilliant son, staring intently at the exchange between his father and his estate manager with an expression of absolute, paralyzing terror on his face. He looked like a man watching his own execution, his green eyes wide and his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and before I could even process why my son was secretly monitoring his own father's blackmail payoff, Harrison rapidly rolled up the window, threw the SUV into reverse, and sped away through a chain-link fence exit, leaving me completely disoriented in my hiding spot. I lowered the opera glasses, my mind racing to connect the impossible dots between Isabella's fake pregnancy, Julian's violent cash collection, and Harrison's terrified surveillance, realizing with sickening clarity that my husband wasn't the primary target of this conspiracy. Robert was draining our life savings and sacrificing his honor not to protect himself, but to shield our son from a threat so massive and terrifying that it had dragged all of them into this desolate, concrete wasteland. I watched Robert slump against the hood of his car, burying his face in his hands as Julian drove away, and I swore to myself right then and there that I would tear this conspiracy out by its roots, no matter how much dirt I had to dig through. Why was my trusting, sweet-natured son lurking in the shadows while my husband handed envelopes of cash to our aggressive estate manager? I raced back to our colonial home before Robert could return, my mind working with cold, calculated precision as I bypassed the kitchen and headed straight for the attic, where Harrison had stored all his overflow paperwork when he moved into his sleek downtown loft 2 years ago. The attic smelled of cedar and old memories, but I ignored the boxes of childhood toys and went straight for the heavy metal filing cabinet pushed into the darkest corner under the eaves. I spent 2 agonizing hours sifting through tax returns, incorporation documents for his software startup, and endless legal contracts, searching for the anomaly that had turned my son into a terrified ghost. At the very bottom of the 3rd drawer, hidden inside an old college textbook, I found a secondary ledger for his company, detailing massive, exorbitant loans from an unlicensed, offshore holding company that charged predatory interest rates that compounded weekly. The signature on the bottom of the loan authorization wasn't Harrison's, it was a digital signature belonging to Isabella, who had convinced him to make her the chief financial officer of his startup just months after their rushed wedding. She had deliberately leveraged his entire company, and by extension his freedom, to shadow investors who operated outside the law, creating a debt so massive it would guarantee federal fraud charges if it were ever brought to light. Suddenly, the front doorbell chimed loudly, echoing all the way up to the attic and breaking my intense concentration, and as I peered through the small dormer window, I saw Isabella's pristine white luxury sedan parked in my driveway. I quickly shoved the ledger into my tote bag, locked the cabinet, and hurried down the stairs, plastering on a pleasant, unbothered smile just as our housekeeper let Isabella into the grand foyer. Isabella stood there in a flawless cream-colored cashmere wrap dress, looking every bit the innocent, glowing expectant mother, holding a box of expensive artisan pastries like a peace offering, but her icy blue eyes were scanning the house like a general surveying a battlefield. "Martha," she said sweetly, stepping forward to offer a hollow kiss on my cheek. "I felt so terrible about the tension at dinner last night. I just had to come over and clear the air between us." I ushered her into the sunlit kitchen, making a pot of Darjeeling tea with slow, deliberate movements, playing the role of the confused but accommodating mother-in-law while studying her every micro-expression. "There's nothing to clear, Isabella," I said smoothly, pouring the hot tea into delicate porcelain cups. "Pregnancy hormones can make us all say wild, imaginative things, and I know Robert is fully committed to helping Harrison through whatever minor financial hiccups his little tech company is experiencing." Isabella's hand stopped midway to her teacup, her perfectly manicured nails digging slightly into the saucer as she realized I was subtly hinting at my knowledge of the money, her jaw tightening just a fraction of an inch before she recovered her composure. "Harrison's company is perfectly fine," she replied, her voice dropping an octave, losing its sugary sweetness. "But you know, Martha, stress is so bad for the baby, and it would be a shame if certain federal authorities started asking questions about where Robert gets his money, wouldn't it?" The veiled threat hung heavily in the air, a clear warning that she was willing to destroy both my husband and my son, but as she stood up abruptly to leave, feigning a sudden wave of nausea, the clasp on her designer purse caught on the edge of the granite counter. The bag spilled open, scattering a tube of expensive lipstick, a pair of sunglasses, and a crumpled white medical receipt across the polished floor, and as I graciously knelt down to help her gather her things, my eyes locked onto the date printed clearly at the top of the clinic receipt. It was a receipt for an initial prenatal ultrasound dated 8 weeks earlier. Harrison had been away on a mandatory month-long coding retreat during the likely conception period, while Robert had been with me throughout our 3-week architectural tour in Europe. Unless Isabella was lying about how far along she was, neither my son nor my husband could possibly be the father. The biological impossibility of Isabella's pregnancy timeline was the loose thread I needed to completely unravel her entire malicious tapestry. After she practically fled my kitchen, I waited 2 days for the perfect opportunity, which arrived when Harrison casually mentioned over a brief phone call that Isabella was spending her entire Thursday afternoon at an exclusive luxury day spa downtown. Knowing Harrison would be locked in back-to-back development meetings at his office, I grabbed my spare key to their ultramodern, glass-walled downtown loft and let myself in, the stark, minimalist decor feeling as cold and uninviting as my daughter-in-law's personality. I moved methodically through the pristine space, ignoring the expensive modern art and the breathtaking city views, heading straight for their expansive master bathroom, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling marble and mirrored cabinets. I knew a woman as calculated as Isabella wouldn't leave a smoking gun in plain sight, so I bypassed the obvious drawers and focused on her massive, velvet-lined jewelry armoire sitting heavily in the corner of her custom walk-in closet. I carefully removed trays of diamond tennis bracelets and heavy gold necklaces, pressing my fingers along the velvet bottom until I felt a slight, unnatural depression in the back left corner, pressing it firmly until a hidden, shallow compartment popped open with a soft click. Inside lay a single, neatly folded piece of heavy stock paper from a high-end private genetics laboratory, and as I unfolded it, my hazel eyes scanned the complex medical jargon, searching for the absolute, undeniable Troy she was hiding. It was a comprehensive prenatal DNA test, ordered privately and expedited for an exorbitant fee, and right there in stark, black and white lettering was the confirmation that the biological father was a 99.9% match to Julian Vance, our supposedly rugged, blue-collar estate manager. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. She was carrying the child of her co-conspirator while using the pregnancy to blackmail my husband into covering her tracks and funding their extravagant lifestyle. But the DNA test wasn't the only thing hidden. In that velvet compartment, beneath it lay a heavily redacted, printed draft of an extortion letter, explicitly detailing the exact timeline of when they would drain the last of Robert's retirement funds before anonymously reporting Harrison to the SEC for the fraudulent loans she had orchestrated. I pulled out my smartphone, making sure the flash was off, and took high-resolution photographs of every single page, my hands steady as stone, knowing I had just captured the lethal ammunition required to save my family from complete annihilation. Just as I folded the documents back into their precise original creases, the electronic deadbolt on the front door of the loft beeped loudly, followed by the heavy, unmistakable thud of the door closing and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Isabella's stiletto heels echoing against the hardwood floors. She was supposed to be at the spa for another 3 hours, but here she was, walking briskly toward the master bedroom, humming a cheerful, tuneless melody that sounded horrifyingly loud in the silent apartment. I shoved the hidden compartment shut, rapidly replaced the jewelry trays, and silently backed into the deep shadows of the massive walk-in closet, hiding myself behind a row of heavy winter coats just seconds before she stepped into the room. Through a small gap in the clothing, I watched Isabella drop her designer bag on the bed, pull out her phone, and dial a number, her voice dropping into a demanding, harsh tone as she spoke to the person on the other end. "Julian, it's me," she snapped, pacing back and forth in front of the closet doors. "The old man is starting to drag his feet on the next payment, and Martha is snooping around, asking too many subtle questions, so I want you to go to Robert's office tomorrow and physically threaten him if you have to." She paused, listening to Julian's response, before letting out a cruel, chilling laugh that echoed off the marble walls, saying, "I don't care if his heart can't take the stress, Julian. If he dies before he signs the trust over, we just take the estate from Harrison anyway, because the idiot still thinks he's the father." I clamped my hand over my mouth, suppressing a gasp as the true depths of her sociopathy revealed itself, realizing with terrifying clarity that she wasn't just trying to steal our money, she was fully prepared to let my husband die to get it. Armed with the absolute proof of her extortion, I was ready to burn Isabella's world down, but my husband's fragile heart gave out before I could strike the match. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the call came from the local hospital. Robert had collapsed in his university office, suffering a stress-induced myocardial infarction, a direct, physical consequence of the crushing weight of Isabella and Julian's relentless blackmail. I drove to the emergency room like a woman possessed, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, ignoring speed limits and blaring horns, fueled by a primal, protective rage that completely stripped away my refined, aristocratic exterior. When I finally reached the cardiac intensive care unit, the rhythmic, electronic beeping of the heart monitors echoed in the sterile hallway, but as I approached Robert's private room, I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running instantly cold. Through the small glass window of the heavy wooden door, I saw Isabella leaning aggressively over Robert's hospital bed, her platinum blonde hair falling like a curtain around her face, blocking his view of the door. Robert looked terrifyingly weak, his skin pale and gray against the white hospital sheets, an oxygen tube taped under his nose, his eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and profound fear as Isabella whispered venomous words directly into his ear. I silently pushed the door open just a fraction of an inch, close enough to hear her cold, demanding voice telling him that if he didn't sign the legal document she was aggressively shoving into his trembling hands, she would leak the offshore loan documents to the FBI before his heart rate returned to normal. "Sign the power of attorney, Robert," she hissed, pressing an expensive silver fountain pen against his palm, "or your precious son spends the best years of his life in a federal penitentiary, and Martha loses everything she's ever cared about." The sheer cruelty of watching this sociopath torture a man who had just survived a heart attack shattered the last remnants of my civilized restraint, and I kicked the heavy door fully open, the wood crashing violently against the wall stop with a sound like a gunshot. Isabella jumped back, genuinely startled, her perfectly composed mask slipping for a fraction of a second as I marched directly to the bed, violently snatching the dense legal document and the pen right out of her hands. "Get away from my husband before I have security drag you out by your expensive extensions," I ordered, my voice deadly quiet and vibrating with a fury so intense it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Isabella quickly recovered, straightening her spine and crossing her arms defensively, attempting to project her usual arrogant dominance. "I'm family, Martha, and I'm just helping Robert get his affairs in order because he's clearly failing." I stepped directly into her personal space, locking my fierce hazel eyes onto her icy blue ones, and whispered, "I know about the offshore loans, I know about Julian, and I know exactly whose baby you are carrying, so you have exactly 5 seconds to leave this room before I call the police." Her eyes widened in genuine panic, realizing instantly that all her leverage had just evaporated, and without saying another word, she turned on her heel and practically sprinted out of the room, her heels clicking frantically down the corridor. As the door swung shut, I turned to Robert, whose eyes were filled with tears of profound relief and deep, agonizing shame, and I gently took his cold, shaking hand in mine, kissing his knuckles softly. "Martha, I'm so sorry," he wept, his voice raspy and broken. "She set Harrison up, she created the fake investors, and she told me if I didn't claim I was paying her off for an affair, she would destroy him. I smoothed the thinning gray hair back from his damp forehead, my heart breaking for the agonizing burden he had carried alone, and I promised him, with unwavering certainty, that Isabella and Julian were about to face a reckoning they could never possibly imagine. Hearing my husband sob in that sterile hospital bed, confessing that he took the blame for a disgusting fake affair just to keep our son out of federal prison, awakened a royless, calculating vengeance inside me that I never knew I possessed. I spent the next 3 days sitting faithfully by Robert's side as he recovered, offering him reassuring smiles and warm tea, while secretly operating a shadow war from my laptop and burner phone in the hospital cafeteria. I knew the photographs of the DNA test and the extortion drafts were powerful, but they weren't enough to permanently neutralize the threat. I needed to completely dismantle their financial traps so Harrison would be shielded from any legal blowback when the Troy exploded. I reached out to an old family friend, a fiercely discreet and brilliant forensic accountant named Roy Sterling, who specialized in tracing hidden assets for high-net-worth divorces, paying him a massive retainer in cash to immediately tear into the offshore holding company Isabella had used to leverage Harrison's startup. Roy worked around the clock, his digital expertise cutting through Isabella's layered shell companies like a hot knife through butter, while I played the role of the devoted, oblivious mother-in-law, answering Harrison's frantic, worried text messages about his father's health with soothing, generic platitudes. On Thursday night, at exactly 2 a.m, my phone vibrated on the small bedside table in Robert's hospital room, and I slipped out into the quiet, dimly lit corridor to answer Roy's call, my heart pounding with anticipation. "Martha, you're not going to believe what I found," Roy said, his voice crackling with excitement and exhaustion. "This isn't their first rodeo. The offshore company, Apex Holdings, is registered to a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands, but the IP address used to authorize the transfers traces directly back to Julian Vance's personal laptop." But Roy wasn't finished. He explained that he had run a cross-reference on Julian and Isabella's financial histories and discovered they had successfully executed this exact same predatory loan and extortion scheme on 2 other wealthy tech families in California and Texas over the past 4 years, leaving a trail of bankruptcies and ruined lives in their wake. They use Isabella's looks and charm to infiltrate the family, create fake debt, and use a fabricated scandal to extract the cash, Roy explained. "I have the complete, undeniable digital footprint, Martha, enough to hand them over to the feds on a silver platter." A cold, victorious smile spread across my face as I thanked Roy, instructing him to print every single document, every IP trace, and every fraudulent signature into a massive, undeniable physical dossier and deliver it to my home by Sunday morning. The trap was now fully constructed, baited, and armed, but I didn't just want to hand them over to the authorities in silence. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror, humiliation, and helplessness they had inflicted on my husband and my son. The next morning, as the doctors officially discharged a much healthier, relieved Robert, I pulled out my phone and sent a group text to Harrison and Isabella, my thumbs flying across the screen with practiced ease. The message read, "Robert is coming home today, and considering the recent health scare, we have decided it is time to formally restructure the family trust and hand over financial control. Please join us for a mandatory celebration dinner this Sunday at 7. But the real masterstroke was the separate, polite email I sent directly to Julian Vance, formally requesting his presence at the dinner to discuss his final, substantial compensation package for the estate renovations, knowing his greed would absolutely guarantee his attendance. As I drove Robert home, the autumn leaves swirling around our car in a vibrant display of reds and golds, I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over me, knowing that the storm I was about to unleash would finally wash our family clean. The hunter had become the hunted, and I was about to serve my sociopathic daughter-in-law a feast of her own absolute destruction. By Sunday evening, our grand dining room was a masterclass in psychological warfare, set with the finest crystal, polished antique silver, and towering centerpieces of blood-red dahlias, projecting an image of immense, untouchable wealth that I knew would make Isabella and Julian salivate with greed. I wore a structured, dark charcoal suit that felt like armor, while Robert, looking significantly stronger and remarkably calm, sat at the head of the table in his favorite tweed jacket, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Harrison arrived first, looking incredibly stressed but hopeful, completely unaware that his entire reality was about to shatter, followed shortly by Isabella, who glided in wearing a stunning, form-fitting emerald dress that subtly highlighted the pregnancy she had weaponized against the family, her icy blue eyes glittering with the anticipation of finally getting her hands on our estate. To Harrison's visible confusion, Julian Vance arrived exactly at 7, swaggering through our front door in a tailored black suit that looked completely unnatural on his rugged frame, trying to project an air of professional confidence while shooting Isabella subtle, conspiratorial glances. I guided everyone to their assigned seats, deliberately placing Isabella and Julian across from each other, leaving Harrison seated next to his father, effectively isolating the predators from their prey. The first course of roasted butternut squash soup was served in absolute, suffocating silence, the only sound the sharp clinking of heavy silver spoons against fine porcelain, the tension in the room so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Isabella, unable to contain her arrogant triumph any longer, elegantly dabbed her lips with a linen napkin and raised her crystal wine glass, commanding the attention of the table with a sugary, toxic smile. "Martha, Robert," she began, her voice dripping with fake affection, "Harrison and I are just so incredibly relieved that Robert is recovering, and we are so grateful that you've finally realized it's time to let us take the reins of the family's financial future, especially with the new baby coming." She looked directly at Robert, expecting him to eagerly agree and officially surrender the trust, while Julian sat back in his chair, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips, waiting for his massive payday. I didn't say a word. Instead, I calmly picked up my wine glass, took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive Cabernet, and reached under the edge of the mahogany table, my fingers finding the small, electronic security remote I had asked our alarm company to install on Friday. With a firm, satisfying press of the button, the heavy, solid oak double doors of the dining room swung shut with a violent slam, followed instantly by the loud, mechanical clack of the electronic deadbolts sliding into place, sealing us all inside the room. Julian jumped slightly in his chair, his smirk instantly vanishing as he looked back at the locked doors, while Isabella's glass hovered frozen in mid-air, her predatory instincts finally registering that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. "What is this, Mom?" Harrison asked, looking frantically between the locked doors and my completely calm, stony expression, his voice trembling with a sudden, inexplicable dread. I slowly lowered my glass, locked my piercing hazel eyes onto Isabella's suddenly pale face, and smiled a smile devoid of any warmth or mercy, a smile that promised absolute ruin. "This, Harrison," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings like a judge delivering a death sentence, "is the part of the evening where we discuss exactly what you have been investing in, and exactly whose child your lovely wife is actually carrying." The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was explosive, a vacuum of air right before a massive detonation, and as Julian slowly began to push his chair back from the table, preparing to run, I casually placed a thick, heavy black binder right in the center of the table. The sound of the doors locking echoed through the dining room like a judge's gavel, and I watched with immense satisfaction as the blood completely drained from Isabella's perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost in an emerald dress. Without breaking eye contact with her, I reached into the thick black binder and slid a heavy stack of glossy photographs and printed IP logs straight down the polished mahogany table, stopping right in front of Harrison's plate. "Open it, Harrison," I commanded, my voice projecting an absolute, unyielding authority that left no room for hesitation, and my son, his hands shaking violently, slowly lifted the cover of the dossier. The very first page was the high-resolution photograph of the prenatal DNA test I had found in Isabella's jewelry box, the bold letters declaring Julian Vance as the biological father practically leaping off the page, followed immediately by the printed drafts of the extortion letters targeting Robert. Harrison stared at the paper, his green eyes darting frantically back and forth across the text as his brain struggled to process the monumental, world-shattering betrayal, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the reality of his wife's monstrosity set in. "This is a fake!" Isabella suddenly shrieked, her aristocratic mask completely shattering as she slammed her hands on the table, her voice shrill and desperate. "Martha is insane. She forged this because she hates me, Harrison. You know she's always hated me." She lunged across the table, desperately trying to snatch the DNA test away, but Robert stood up with surprising speed and strength, slamming his hand down on the papers to protect them, glaring at his daughter-in-law with a fierce, righteous anger. "Sit down, Isabella," Robert bellowed, his voice booming with the authority of a man who was no longer afraid, "or I will have the police break down those doors and arrest you for extortion right this second." Harrison, completely ignoring the chaos, flipped to the next section of the binder, his face turning from pale to a deep, dangerous red as he read Roy's forensic accounting report, detailing exactly how Isabella had orchestrated the fraudulent offshore loans and how Julian had routed the money. The realization that his failing startup wasn't a business failure, but a calculated, predatory sabotage executed by the woman he loved, hit Harrison like a physical blow, and he slowly turned his head to look at Isabella, his eyes completely devoid of the sweet, trusting boy he used to be. "You set me up," Harrison whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of profound grief and explosive, volcanic rage. "You used my company, you threatened my father, and you're carrying his baby?" He pointed a trembling finger directly at Julian, who was now sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the locked room, realizing that he was trapped in a cage with a family that had finally woken up. Seeing the undeniable, digital proof of his federal wire fraud sitting on the table, Julian's self-preservation instincts violently kicked in, and he immediately decided to throw Isabella completely under the bus to save himself. It was all her idea. Julian shouted, jumping to his feet and backing away from the table, pointing accusatorily at Isabella. "She targeted you, Harrison. She set up the fake holding company in the Caymans. I just made the collections. She's the one who masterminded the whole damn thing." Isabella let out a feral, ear-piercing scream of pure rage at Julian's sudden betrayal, grabbing her heavy crystal wine glass and hurling it violently across the room, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces against the antique mahogany sideboard. I sat back in my chair, sipping my wine and watching the two sociopaths violently turn on each other, their elaborate, cruel conspiracy collapsing into pathetic, screeching ruins right in the middle of my beautifully set dining room, knowing that the trap had worked perfectly. Watching thieves turn on each other is a distinctly satisfying experience, especially when they are doing it in the middle of your ruined dining room, exposing their true, pathetic nature for all to see. Harrison, having finally heard enough of their screeching accusations and desperate backpedaling, stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor, and slammed his fists down on the table with a force that rattled the fine china. "Shut up," he roared, his voice carrying a raw, devastating power that instantly silenced both Isabella and Julian, freezing them in their tracks like frightened animals caught in the headlights. "You are both completely disgusting," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper as he glared at his wife. "I want you out of my house, I want you out of my life, and if you ever try to contact me or my parents again, I will personally hand this entire binder to the FBI field office downtown." I calmly pressed the button on my remote, the electronic deadbolts clicking open with a loud, final snap, and Julian didn't waste a single second. He bolted for the doors, ripping them open and fleeing into the night without looking back, terrified of the federal prison time hanging over his head. Isabella stood there for a moment, her icy blue eyes darting around the room, realizing she was leaving with absolutely nothing, no estate, no money, and no leverage, before she snatched her designer purse, shot me one last look of pure, venomous defeat, and marched out, the heavy front door slamming shut behind her, echoing through the sudden, peaceful silence of our home. In the exhausting, emotional weeks that followed, the healing process was incredibly difficult but absolutely necessary. Harrison moved back into his childhood bedroom for a few months, working tirelessly with a team of corporate lawyers we hired to completely untangle his startup from Isabella's fraudulent offshore entities, taking legal responsibility for the mess while ensuring she could never weaponize the debt against him. Robert's health steadily improved as the toxic, crushing weight of the blackmail was finally lifted, and our marriage, having survived the ultimate test of loyalty and fear, emerged stronger and more deeply connected than it had been in decades. 6 months later, as the spring flowers began to bloom in our meticulously kept garden, I received a thin, cheap envelope in the mail with a return address from a low-security women's correctional facility in Texas. Roy's forensic evidence had been used in a separate, previous fraud case, and Isabella had finally been caught. The letter inside was a pathetic, manipulative plea for financial help for her newborn child, claiming she had changed and begging for forgiveness, written in the same sugary, fake tone she had used to terrorize my family. I didn't even read past the first paragraph. I calmly walked into Robert's study, fed the letter directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder, and listened to the satisfying whir of the blades destroying her final attempt at manipulation. I walked out to the sunlit patio where Robert and Harrison were laughing over a cup of coffee, the shadows of the past finally banished by the warm morning light, and took my seat at the table. I had learned that true, enduring family strength isn't about maintaining a perfect, polished illusion of a flawless life. It's about having the absolute, royalist courage to face the darkest, ugliest Troys, and being willing to burn down anyone who dares try to destroy the people you love.